You're listening to In Defense with Dr. R.G. Willert, a Christian apologetics podcast equipping you to give a defense for the hope that is in you and to speak truth in Jesus' name. In the first episode of this short mini-series, Dr. Willert will be answering some questions from listeners to give us a broader understanding of the Kalam Cosmological argument.
You are listening to In Defense with me, Dr. R.G. Willert, a Christian apologetic podcast bringing you an appeal and defense of the Christian faith. We are back with another series for you. I'm excited for the series, and we have a guest here with us. Before I introduce him, let me tell you a little bit about this series that we are doing. It is called the Checking In series. So one of the things I really wanted to do is halfway through the year and at the end of the year, produce a series where I tackle the questions that I have received on the different topics that we discuss. So that is what we are doing in this series. But in order to do that, I brought on my editor, my man right here, Eric. I almost called you Dr. Eric Stroud, but Eric Stroud here. He's the editor over at The River Radio. He's been doing the podcast and doing all the editing, and he's the wonderful voice you hear at the beginning of each episode. And I thought it would be great to have him write us some questions, because he's the one that has to listen to my voice in these episodes over and over again, in which I apologize for. So what greater person to have while talking about these episodes that we did is my editor here, Eric Stroud. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for a little bit? Tell us about your life. Tell us about the work that you are doing, and just get these guys and our listeners to know more about you.
Oh, man, where do you want me to start?
Start from your birth. No, I'm just kidding. So, just tell us a little bit about your age, relationships, work, maybe a little talk about your Christian faith. And
I have been working. So I'm a producer here at the radio station, and it's 104.9 The River here in Columbus, Ohio. And about, I want to say 8 months ago, we stared working together. Yeah. It's probably been around that long.
Has it been 8 since we've been recording?
Something
or just
like
sort of
that,
dialoguing about the idea?
But
I think it's been a while.
But yeah, I started working here a couple of years ago, and my primary job is to produce podcasts and video stuff for the radio station. And I'm a graduate of a Christian university here in Ohio, Cedarville University, just about an hour south from here. And over the course of the last 4 years or so has been a pretty transformative experience for me, not only professionally, because I've had to grow up and move out, but also I have been kind of tackling a lot of theological things with regard to some of my relationships with my friends, my coworkers, my fiance. I'm going to get married next month, which is super weird. Yeah. So when I had my manager come to me and he was like, yeah, we're going to do an apologetics podcast. I'm like, great. This is something I've been, wanting to do for a while. Is I've been looking for resources to sort of strengthen my faith, my logical framework, and the things that I interact with on a daily basis. So it's actually been a huge blessing to be able to work with you like this. It's really been cool.
Same here.
Because I sit on the end of that wall most days, and I listen to you, talk about all this stuff that's way over my head. And I think to myself, man, I kind of wish I was in the room with him. So now I actually get to do that, which is really cool.
So what are some questions that you often hear your friends or family ask?
A lot of it.
The categories.
Yeah. I guess if I had to boil it down, a lot of theological questions usually fall into one of two categories. It's either a natural category or a logical category, where in the natural category, you've got questions like, well, if God exists, then why is there decay and corruption in the world?
So in the natural order of things.
In the natural order of things.
Interesting.
Or if God exists, then why is the history of the world this way? Why can we look at the fossil record and say that, maybe this is way older than the book of Genesis actually leads us to believe?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And then, so you've got stuff like that. Yeah. And then in the logical category, you have things kind of like what we talked about with the Kalam, with what's a way that you can logically find God with the data that we're working with in our everyday lives.
So is the belief in God reasonable?
Yes.
That sort of question. Okay. Yeah.
So am I a fool for believing in an all-powerful God? Or is this something that I can actually take to the bank and say, yeah, there's actually a reason that I can believe in this? Sure. Even if I'm wrong, there's a reason that I can logically arrive at that conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like that's a lot of what I've been receiving over the past year from like family members, from friends, and even like wrestling in my own heart, thinking about why do I believe what I believe?
Absolutely.
So, and like I said, being on the other side of that wall and listening to you has actually been really cool.
Yeah.
Because it gives me some things that I get to kind of wrestle with and chew on when I walk out of my editing bay.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not the only one. I mean, the more and more I talk to people, especially joining a church in this area and being in a really great small group, it's nice to talk about what the pastor's saying on a Sunday morning. We all agree with that.
Yeah.
The pastor has some great points, and it's good to sort of recap or rethink about sort of what we already know about Bible stories say and sort of the lessons that they're teaching us. But I don't think it naturally attacks all of the questions that we will have in our lives. I just don't think it does. I think church assumes correctly what it is and what it's for. I would say correctly to some degree, right? Not all churches, but if that's the case and you hold a few assumptions, I think it then allows us not to tackle certain things that people who don't hold those assumptions and being believers question. And not only it's helpful for us, because I know a lot of the small group people have these questions. And I just recently gave a handful of sources to one of the guys in our small group because they have a buddy who's on the spiritual journey and has a lot of the questions that we kind of talked about in the Kalam. And he's like, yeah, I never knew this stuff existed. I'm like, yeah, it's because I think these naturally working assumptions that churches have, but it needs to be a both and. I don't think it's one or the other. We leave our minds at the door when it's all spiritual. I think it's just a both and. You have Sunday morning, you have your small group, and then you tackle these sort of things. And if we can get the idea it's a both and in the world of Christian believers, I think it's a great step forward, in my opinion.
I completely agree.
But I think it's very helpful to have you here. It's helpful to see who's behind the screen or behind the wall, I should say. And I think this will be a good sort of dialogue and conversations to the questions that you have written down just listening, as well as our listeners and viewers have been writing in. So we're going to start off this first episode. And this first episode is on the topic of the Kalam. I think we did, was it 8-part series?
It was a 6-part series.
6-part series on the Kalam Cosmological argument. We didn't tackle everything in there, obviously, because if you look at the history, I keep touching that. If you look at the history, I'm going to stop touching that, of it, it's,
centuries. So
quickly do an overview of it.
You can't get through multiple centuries worth of work in 6 episodes. Or
hundreds of books and papers, and people would hate me after a while. They'd be like, we get the point, Ryan.
Gotta move on.
Like next series. So let's tackle this first episode of the Kalam in the Checking In series. I believe we have 6 questions pertaining to the topic. So I'm going to toss it over to you.
Yeah.
We're going to have you, what's the question? Then we'll just sort of have a dialogue and some of my answers and go back and forth when it comes to that.
Yeah. So some of these questions are some of my own that I've been coming up with as I've been listening to the series and working on it. And then, like you said, a lot of these are other questions that we've received from listeners, which is really, really cool and was honestly kind of encouraging to me because I was like, oh, shoot, people are actually listening. This is amazing.
Yeah.
So we've got this first question, I believe, is one of mine. And it says, are there any other arguments for God's existence that you like?
Sure.
Aside from the Kalam, what are some other ones? What are some other ones that we can talk about?
Absolutely. So let me toss this over to you real fast. Do you know of any? Have you heard of any? Be interesting just to get your point of view of thinking about this.
The only one that I know of is the ontological argument.
Okay.
Where, if I'm correct, that's the one that says, if God is that which, then no greater thing can be conceived than he must exist.
Yeah, so it's sort of, there's a lot of versions of it. There's Anselm's, and then I like Plantinga's ontological argument. I think it's sound, but I still think, basically the idea is, if it's possible for God to exist, God exists.
Yeah.
And I think the question that we need to answer prior to that is, do we think it's possible? Because there are people who don't think it's possible, so the ontological argument's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think if you go, oh, it's possible, the arguments sound, whether you find it convincing or not.
Yeah.
So I know a lot of people go, yeah, the argument works deductively. I just don't find it convincing. And I'm perfectly okay with that. That is actually not one I put on here.
Mm-hmm.
It's personally my least favorite argument.
I think I would agree with that.
I think it's my least favorite argument. I do think it works. I do think the conclusion follows for the premises, especially Plantinga's version. I think it's hard to get people to go, okay, I think it's possible, because a lot of people think anything is possible, right?
Yeah.
Therefore, I must believe.
Right.
And I think to get past that step, you need other type arguments, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a few I have listed here. There's a few. The first one is called the Leibnizian argument from contingency.
Okay.
Leibniz. Leibniz is a freak of nature, basically invented portions of math. We'll put it that way. He's a freak of nature when it comes to thinking. And so this is kind of the argument laid out for you. And then we can kind of discuss a little bit. So it says this: anything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Now, people just leave it at that. If you read his work, there's sort of a nuance to this idea, because you might go, well, I reject that because something could just always exist, right? And doesn't have an explanation. But this is what he says: anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or an external cause.
Okay.
So either it exists by its own nature or has a cause that's external to itself.
So in that, you would say that God is the exception to that, where he's the...
I don't think he's the exception to that. I think he would say, well, he exists by the necessity
of his own nature.
Of his own nature, correct.
Yeah.
So there's either two forms. You exist by necessity or you exist by contingency.
Yep.
Either in your own nature, right? Or by the creation of something else.
Right.
Something you're contingent, and there's something that brought you into existence.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of the first premise. The second is, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. And you go into argue that, right?
Yeah, yeah. So it's sort of following, kind of similar to the Kalam.
So it's in like deductive form, where if the premises are true or more likely true than not, we should accept the conclusion, right? Premise 3, the universe exists. Premise 4, therefore the universe has an explanation of its existence, which comes from 1 and 3, right? Conclusion, therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is God. So what you would do here, clearly, 1 just seems obviously true. I don't really know of any other 2 possibilities. Either
something exists out of necessity, or it doesn't.
Or it's contingent,
on something else.
The universe exists, right?
Obviously.
Even if you think this is all illusion or computer like simulation, it still exists somewhere.
Yeah.
If you think it's some mind, like a Boltzmann brain or something like that, that might not be physical, right? It still exists in
provably.
Yeah, it still exists, right? Whether that universe be like the size of a box or not, who knows?
Right.
So we do know 1 is true, 3 is true. The question is the explanation of existence the best God, right? And so what the argument does goes on to argue that God is the best explanation of it. So we're not going to go into all of the points here, but that's one of my favorite arguments. I think the Kalam could be added as sort of an addendum. Here, let me show you why the universe doesn't exist necessarily. Kalam.
Exactly.
Right? Okay, so it's contingent.
Right.
So we do know then what's the best explanation? Well, something that is not contingent and is necessary. And I think the Kalam can show that. So I think these 2 work really, really well together as a 1 and 2 kind of punch type thing. My next favorite argument is called the fine-tuning argument. I'm sure most of our listeners have heard about that. Have you heard that argument before? Idea from fine-tuning?
Maybe in practice. I don't think I've ever heard of it by name.
And there are brilliant Christian philosophers, cosmologists, astrophysicists who all look at this argument and go, wow. In fact, most scientists are won by looking at this kind of argument, right?
This is one that I'm particularly interested in.
Sure, where they'll say, hey, if any argument's going to persuade me, this is the argument. And so I'm going to look at Luke Barnes. He is a theoretical astrophysicist and cosmologist. He has his PhD in astronomy. And he is a Christian scientist who most of his work and PhD work is on the fine-tuning of the universe, specifically within like galaxy formation. Sure. So he's a freak of nature.
Yeah, yeah.
Just put it that way. He's one of those guys who's just like, what in the world?
He walks into the room and he makes you feel small.
Yeah, exactly. He walks into a Christmas dinner and you're like, just stop. Let's not talk about science right now. Let's talk about like football or
We're
something.
having a good time. Everyone else is enjoying themselves.
Exactly. It'd be fun to pick his brain and get him on here, but he's just brilliant.
Yeah.
So this is sort of how he lays out his fine-tuning thought process really simply, right? He has articles and books. His book out there he brings in other physicists and theoretical cosmologists to put their work together and stuff like that. So this is what he says. What is fine-tuning? What is the fine-tuning of the universe? Fine-tuning is about life-permitting universes relative to the total amount of universes. Now, that's not to say these other universes exist. It's to say, like, relative to the total possible way the universe could be. So the universe could
be a lot more hostile.
Could be different sets of fundamental particles. It could be this case.
Yep.
That's what all the physicists say. So it's what is this fine life permitting universe in relation to the total possible universes. Now, that's not to say they exist, right?
Right.
Because we don't know if they do. No one has ever proven if they do. There's a lot of scientists out there say even if they do like have bubble universes or multiverses universes, you could not ever even go to them to prove they exist, right? It's all theories at this point.
Right.
And so this is what he says. Any universe that could exist will be unique and strange in its own right. But the question is not why it is odd or unique that we live in a life-permitting universe, right? The question is how finely tuned it is to have a life-permitting universe.
Okay.
So this is what he says. But the question is not why it is odd or unique, but whether a life-permitting universe is. The question is how tuned it is not just to hit our universe, but to hit a universe in general that can permit life. So it's not just how weird our universe is, how finely tuned, how our universe can produce life. It's how tuned a universe might be to at least be life permitting.
Yep.
Do you see the difference?
Right.
It's not looking at a universe and going, oh, look at all the cool numbers that we can do, but it's how tuned a universe must be to just get life in general.
Life in general. Yeah.
Right? And so this is the number he puts out when it comes to the probability. 10 to the 10 to the 60 power. So you have 10 to the 10th power to the 60th power.
That's a lot of zeros.
Some scholars, which he writes, is 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power. William Lane Craig gives this example, right? He says this, picture a lottery, which there is a billion. Think of that number. There's a billion, billions. Think about how crazy you have a billions.
So this is, and that's the number.
Let me give you an example, right?
Yeah.
Of what this would mean. Of white ping pong balls.
Okay. Yep.
Picture an area with a billion white ping pong balls.
We'll fill the Milky Way galaxy. White ping pong balls.
But you add one orange ping pong ball to the mix.
Yep.
Throw it somewhere in there, mix it up, wherever that might be. So what we come to find is that every single unique ball has the same probability of being drawn out of the whole.
Yep.
It just does.
Yeah.
If I draw this one, it's 1 in a billions. If I draw this other white one, it's 1 in a billion. If I draw this orange one, it's 1 in a billions. But that's not the question. The question is, and it's insanely, overwhelmingly more probable that you are going to draw a white ball over an orange ball.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the idea of when we look at the fine tuning, what is how tuned it must be to have just a life permitting universe in general of getting that orange ball.
Okay. Now I'm beginning to put the pieces together. I'm starting to understand how this argument kind of works.
So it's okay, it's not what's the probability of getting the orange ball out of all the balls? It's what must it take for you
to even find it?
To pick that ball
in
general? How highly improbable is that? And they'll say, well, it's 10 to the 10 to the 60th power. And so you look at that and go, what in the world? Like that the highly improbable that we find ourselves in at a generalized universe that permits life to the degree that we understand life, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of fundamental things. Hugh Ross in his work gives like 143 different, I think it's 143 different criteria that must be met in general just to permit the kind of life we have. Like it's crazy to think about.
And this isn't just like, we aren't even talking about sapient life. We're talking about, or excuse me, at the life at a single cell level. We're talking about sapient life.
If you want to say there are other planets.
Yep.
And Hugh Ross has a good book on aliens, which I'll get to in one of my arguments. If you want to say we have a life with single-celled amoebas, I'll go, okay, I don't care if we have a planet out there. I'm talking about like, do we have carbon-based life form that meet in specific areas that meet the 143 specific requirements to get the kind of life we are.
Right.
Right. And if you want to say, yeah, there is this dog on this other planet, I don't really care. That's not the kind of like,
that's not what we're talking about. Yeah.
We're not talking about that. So there's 3 options in the literature to explain the fine tuning.
Okay.
Right. It is chance, necessity, or design. Those are the 3 options in the literature: chance, necessity, or design. Now, there's someone named Graham Oppie who I've read his book. I've read his book on infinity, philosophy of infinity and stuff like that. He's brilliant. He's an Australian guy, just brilliant, right? He's an atheist. I think his arguments are false. But he argues without evidence, and I just without evidence, he just asserts that every fundamental particle exists by necessity.
Of its own accord.
Meaning we are like our universe is necessary.
Yes.
There's no reason to think that. I don't know one scientist that thinks that it is logically that the fundamental particles could have not been something else or a different number or arranged in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And so you just can't assert it's necessary. You need to prove why they couldn't have been something else. And I don't know one theoretical physicist that doesn't think, oh, it could have been something else. In fact, a lot of their work on this uses mathematics to show that it could be something else. And so I think necessity, without any argument, is just off the table.
The universe
could have been something different.
The universe doesn't exist out of necessity.
Sure, it could have been a different way, which doesn't produce life in general, right?
Yeah.
It's very easy to understand.
Very possible.
Very possible.
Especially with the number that you just gave me with regard to the likelihood of it actually not being any of those things.
True, right, exactly. And so the next thing is, okay, if we don't think it's by necessity, is it by chance? Well, we'll then look back at these numbers and go, what is the chance of 10 to the 10 to the 123? I mean, like that number is so insanely small to think about. If you used that number in any other aspect of your life to make a decision and went, okay, like, is my chance of not getting in a car accident today, not getting into it, this number, I would never get in my car.
Yeah.
I would wait for tomorrow.
Yeah.
If someone stepped down, hey, just let you know, your chance of getting into a car accident is not getting in a car accident, meaning I will, is like this crazy.
Yeah.
I'd be like, okay, I'll just wait for tomorrow because I would be irrational to think that I'm going to be safe in my car given how crazy this number is, right?
Yeah.
And so to think it's by chance, you would have to, I think, justify why this billion to the billion to the billion number is a rational number to think it just happened by chance.
Yeah. And it's somehow more probable than
and you can go to the multiverse theories, which has never been proven. There's so many arguments. We can do a whole episode on that. I think there are Achilles heel death blows to the multiverse, such as an infinity argument. I think Boltzmann brain argument. We'll talk about that later. So if you don't think it's by chance because it's so small, and we know it could have been something else, the other option is design. That something seemed to have imbued the universe out of all the possible ways it could have been to have this crazy percentage of just being life permitting in general.
Yeah. And then you ratchet that down to the planetary level about which we haven't found, to my knowledge, at least.
This is just life permitting, let alone then getting life.
Right.
It's crazy to think about.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to say universe can produce life. It's another thing will it produce life? And what will include it to need to produce life on top of that?
Yeah.
So once you look at that, you go, okay, maybe the design hypothesis is starting to look very probable on top of all of the other arguments of Kalam,
Yeah.
Leibniz contingency.
Right.
Like you start going, whoa, maybe design
Maybe that's not such a
is looking,
far-fetched thing.
maybe the probability of design is looking greater than 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power, right?
Yeah.
And so the fine-tuning argument I think is persuasive when you take a look at the data, and especially when you build it on top of all the other arguments.
Mhm.
The other argument I love is the moral argument. It's for objective moral commands and duties, right?
Yeah.
Or moral values. I think you could put it in there. I think William Lane Craig argues persuasively. So this is how he lays out the argument. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. He might say objective moral commands and duties do not exist, right? Objective moral values do exist, therefore God exists. And it is laid out in the deductive form, which we talked about, I think, in episode 1 or 2.
Yes.
Of that, if the premises are
true, then
or
the
more
conclusion
possibly true,
follows.
the conclusion follows. And so what he does is he shows that, one, we all believe objective moral values do exist, right? You might not, but you might be the guy that goes, oh, dear Lord.
Yeah.
Like if I were to say to you, I think it is morally wrong to sacrifice and kill babies just for fun. I don't know of a person who really isn't kind of
I put off by
problematic.
that. Yeah.
that would go put off by that wouldn't go, I think you're right. I don't think we should just slaughter innocent babies because you're bored on a Thursday night.
Yep.
Right?
Right.
And if that's the case, my next question would be like, well, do you think that stands for people 100 years ago?
Do you think that throughout all of history,
Yeah, that should be the case.
that hasn't changed?
That fact is true. And if
Yeah.
you go, sure, you're making a non-subjective fact on all of culture throughout history that, no, this is true regardless of your subjective point of view.
Yeah.
And if you don't think this is true, right, then clearly your subjective point of view is not functioning correctly. And so that's what people would say. Yeah, I think this is objective in that way. It doesn't require cultures or your point of view to say it's true. It's just true,
Yeah.
regardless of the fact, right?
Well, because that was going to be my next question is then how do you justify any kind of objective truth? If like,
Sure.
'cause
Well, that's
let's
what he's
say-
getting to, right? Exactly.
let's say, for example, like you do have a truth that can be assumed to be objective. I don't know that you could ever prove something to be completely objective unless you got a unanimous vote through all of history.
So here's
that
the
it was
thing.
wrong.
Even if everyone throughout history unanimously voted,
Yep.
it doesn't prove that's objective.
Okay.
It just proves everyone's subjective frame
Points in that direction.
points that this is what they believe to be true.
Right.
So but what the whole point of showing this example is to show that you at least believe that some things are universal.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
You at least believe some things are universal. And I think people would say that it's not just our subjective point of view that perfectly matched up.
Mhm.
Right? People would say, no, this is true universally, objectively, independent of what you think.
Right.
I think that's what people would say with this. If you don't, then you have someone like I don't want to say they're Hitler, but you have frames of mind that can give rise to Nazism, where Hitler didn't think this was the case.
Mhm.
That what is true of the Jews is that I can do whatever I want to do. And I live in a subjective moral frame that's good for our culture at time. I mean, that's what they argued in court, right? How dare you put your moral values on us, right? And then the judge basically said, there's a law above our law.
Right.
Meaning there's an objective moral law that you violated, so therefore I can do this for you, on you. So the question is, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. So here's the problem. If our moral values are just regulated to our subjective point of view and culture, right? We can't say there's something true that sort of transcends our personal point of views, our cultures, the way we want to do certain things.
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah.
And so if God does not exist, the question then is, what do you ground these objective moral values and duties in if all that exists is nature and culture, you have complete subjectivity,
Right.
where the claim of someone like the Germans are true. Why? How dare you say we're morally wrong?
Yeah.
What you have then is someone who has more power that can punish someone.
Correct.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so if God does not exist, he goes, what then do you ground it in?
Well, I think that would like over the past, I think we just established, I don't think you can ground it in anything other than this direction that like even on the off chance that you did get a universal opinion, that's the subjective opinion of multiple cultures pointing in the same direction.
Sure. And then a culture, you could not say that in 20 years, a culture shifts.
Yeah.
They can have a completely subjective opinion on something,
right,
which then doesn't give you the universal. And then all the objective universal, quote unquote objective, is then regulated to the subjective category.
Right.
As soon as you get one person to go, I don't think the same, which
it doesn't work.
We live in a world where not everyone thinks the same on these things.
Yeah.
It doesn't work to claim it as quote unquote objective in a transcendent way. And so he goes, okay, well, if God doesn't exist, we can't have them. But people clearly live their lives and think in such a way that there are truly objective moral values. Like I can't just slaughter babies on Thursday night because I'm bored.
Yeah. Even if we don't go outright and say it, like there's an assumed thing. Cause
Sure. We live in a world where, when it comes to like human sexuality, that to put our point of view on someone else is not being tolerant, and we are being morally corrupt to tell someone this is how I think and disagree with you on certain things.
Mm-hmm.
This is the world we live in. We'll get canceled. We say we are bigoted, which is a moral value on how someone's doing. We are ignorant. We are stupid. How dare you put your morality on me? We live in a world that's just this way. And so my question is then, how then do you ground these objectively? I don't think you can. But if you live your life as if you do ground them, I'm going to ask you, how are you grounding these things? And so if you can't ground them, then how dare you point your finger at me?
Yeah.
But we live in a world that we do hold these to be objective, whether we say it or not. And so if God does not exist, we can't have them. So either change the way you live, or you ought to think that a being like God exists. And so this is what they're saying. If God does not exist, we can't have them.
Right.
You live and think that we do, and they do exist. So you should think God therefore exists.
Yeah. So deductively, again, that makes sense.
Yes. And if you go, well, I still don't think he exists, I'm going to ask you then, how do you get these things?
Right.
And why me being stronger than you, taking your wallet is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Morally wrong, not just because our culture doesn't like it.
Right.
And so this argument, I think, is very persuasive, where we go, okay, we should therefore think God exists.
And then I see that you've got one below here that's an inductive reasoning argument to that same thing.
Yeah, inductive is basically like, let's look at the way we see things and try to reason rationally to a very highly probable sort of conclusion. Right. And I have here, if objective moral values exist, God is the best explanation for them.
Yeah. So it's essentially that argument just on the inverse.
On the inverse. True. Okay. Right. Yes, exactly. And so I have other arguments too, if I may. Arguments that I think allow for naturalism to be false, meaning all that exists is the physical matter, just nature. And if naturalism is false, we should lean towards and give a higher probability that a being who transcend the natural realm, because you created it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It possibly exists.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If we go, okay, all that exists isn't nature anymore, then someone who believes in a God is not being irrational, because there is this realm in a sense where naturalism is false, right? And so I give three arguments. First, the resurrection arguments for Jesus. Sure. I think the resurrection arguments through history, where you go, what is the best hypothesis, are so strong, that you would need something so heavy to outweigh them that I don't think it's possible, in my opinion, given everything we know of historicity, given what we know the disciples claimed historically, given what the ancient Jewish sources, extra biblical, were. Hallucination is always like the main go-to. And when I get to the resurrection, I think hallucination by scholars, like actual medical doctors, they say this is the worst argument you could possibly have.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is the number one argument they go to, right?
Right.
Nowadays, people are going to arguments for aliens, and which I'll get to that in a second.
I'm actually really excited for this one.
The resurrection stuff?
No, the alien
Okay,
encounters. Because like this is honestly, I'll be completely honest with you. This is one of the things that like for me, if there is an intelligent form of life beyond our Earth, I think that would be the strongest contention in argument against God. And from my perspective,
and my perspective is actually an argument for God.
I am so excited to hear this.
And
Because do you mind if I kind of like expound on what I mean just before we get into this? Go ahead. Yeah. So the way that the resurrection has always been explained to me is that you have this doctrine of Jesus, who is the kinsman redeemer of mankind.
Sure.
He came to redeem a mankind that sinned against him in the Garden of Eden.
Right.
Knowingly took on this sin against a perfect creator.
Sure.
And brought sin into the world as a result.
Yeah.
So if Jesus came back to redeem mankind, then that necessarily means, at least from my perspective, that there aren't other intelligent beings that require salvation. And if there are, he would have to use a mode unique to those beings, which is never mentioned in Scripture.
Sure.
And so therefore, by conclusion, my conclusion would then follow: God is not the God of E.T. You know?
Okay, that's what you're saying. Yeah.
And if he is, then I should expect that there would be some kind of biblical evidence to point us that, like, hey, we're not the only ones here.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
So I would love, I am so excited to hear what you've got here.
So I like your thoughts on that. I do, and we'll skip to that next, and I'll go back to the NDE arguments. I do think there's two things I would point out in this. I'm trying to get my thoughts correct here.
Yeah.
First, it says he came back and died once and for all for mankind, right?
Yep.
What doesn't follow from that is that he couldn't have redeemed these other creatures in a different way, that their sin didn't require a different kind of redemption.
Right.
Right. It doesn't follow that they're sinners in the first place. If he doesn't give them any moral commands and duties, they could do whatever they want. Right? I don't think lions attacking prey are immoral and need salvation. Right, in a justification legal sense, right?
Yeah.
So I think they could be creatures like that if you think they exist, that kind of thing. I do think he doesn't need to tell us in Scripture. I think, if anything, someone can make an argument that it is sufficient for our salvation, everything that he has allowed us to know, and that doesn't follow that there's not other information that he could still tell us. But I do agree with you, given what I know. I think Jesus is still in human form in a different kind of way, that he's still by the right hand of the Father being our high priest for us continuously.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think Jesus wouldn't take on the nature of these other things, or else you'd have to have some sort of theory where he has like three natures now.
Yeah.
And if that's even possible, if he still stands in relation to human nature, can a human nature take on a different kind of nature? I don't think it's possible, but I also don't think it's necessarily the case that don't exist if what we have is what we have. I do think there are hypotheses that lead you to a different conclusion.
Okay.
And so let me,
what do you got?
One of these episodes I'm going to get his approval, Hugh Ross's approval, because I belong to the Reasons to Believe. I'm in their theology scholarship thing. Actually, when I got invited in, he was the guy that interviewed me, Hugh Ross. So it was kind of cool. He's such a nice guy. Reasons to Believe, go check them out. They're brilliant people. And he has a book with, I forgot the third guy, but I know Kenneth Samples. He's a philosopher. And it's a book called Little Green Lights and Little Men. I'm going to do a book club series on this podcast. I'm going to go through chapter by chapter his argument from the book because it's brilliant. And so here's a quick synopsis of his book. There's two hypotheses in the literature about this. One's called the dimensional hypothesis. The second is called the interdimensional hypothesis.
Okay.
And what they argue is the interdimensional hypothesis gives you a higher probability to believe that what Scripture says about the way the world works is true, given what we know of the data. And so they look through all of the data through like the Blue Book Project, all of these things, right? There's actually, I forgot the name of the third author, but he actually worked for the government in the Area 51, was it 57, 51? Area 51 site, and he knows what's happening. He kind of gives us a clue of what's happening in the literature. And so, but they do the research that I think was through John F. Kennedy and still happening today. And they've determined that a high percentage of these things where people are on the news saying, oh, look at this, is actually known about. It's in the government documents. Here's the proof of it. And there's a lot of things that are fake that they can prove. Here's all the documents that they have. Now, you might have a complete skeptic that goes, I don't believe anything. Mm-hmm. Well, I can't do anything with you.
Yeah, right.
I can't do anything with you because then you're in pure skepticism where I go, what you see, how do you know anything? Right.
Right.
I can't, when someone's pure skeptic, I don't know how you're not skeptic about your skepticism.
Plato talked about that.
Yeah. I mean, like, you should be skeptical about everything,
right?
Even your skepticism, in my opinion. G.K. Chesterton talks about that, right? He has a great line about that.
I love G.K. Chesterton.
One of these days I'll find that line and read it. It's brilliant. But so what they say is, okay, but what we do know, there is this very, 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 very small portion of things that are unexplainable. Mm-hmm. Things that we have tangible evidence, things that, like, to the point where the molecular things of the surrounding plants have changed and they don't know how it's possible. Like, really weird, but it's like a 0.0001%, like really small things. So they go, those things need explaining. And so let's just give it credit that something weird exists in the universe. Let's just assume this for a second.
Sure.
What are the possibilities? The first is dimensional, meaning they're from another planet, from another galaxy, another part of the universe, whatever the case is. The second is interdimensional, meaning we live in a realm where we have whatever we see. There's more dimensions to it. I think string theory proposes there's like 20 some dimensions, and like most of them folded up in the Planck second,
right,
to help push out the other dimensions, right?
Correct.
And so there are dimensions that we don't have purview to, but maybe other beings have purview to and can move in and out of certain ways.
Right.
And so what they do is a half of the book, I would say 2/3 of the book, it's a relatively big book, go through all of the hypotheses of the dimensional, that there's interdimensional, there's dimensional travel, what it would take mathematically if you even assumed light speed on carbon-based creatures. What is required for other life out there? What is this? What is this? What is this? And what you find out, the probability of aliens coming from other planets, especially in the known galaxy that we have already looked into
the observable universe.
Universe. Like, we can already go, we know that part of the universe can't permit carbon-based creatures like us because it meets only 70 of the 143 requirements, right?
Right.
And blah, 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 into the observable universe, which is billions of light years.
Yeah,
what it would need for carbon-based creatures, because that's the only thing we know, giving our fundamental particles, that could be like us, carbon-based, meaning they have matter, meaning they have to follow laws. What it would take, and here is the probability, and it's so ungodly low, I think we would be unjustified to believe that there are other carbon-based creatures coming from other planets to visit. And so they go, you can still believe it, but we need justification given this very, very low probability. Mm-hmm. So here's the other interdimensional hypothesis.
Yep.
Meaning we have creatures that can go into different dimensions.
That can do
certain between things, the ones, and how these other dimensions we theoretically know work, that can do certain things. And once they go, wow, look at the probability given this dimensional, it's highly more probable that these creatures work in interdimensional hypothesis, that they're in different dimensions that we can't experience right now. Why all of a sudden this thing can move from here to here within a second? It's impossible given what we know of, right? And so what they do is they give these probabilities and go, we should believe the interdimensional hypothesis to hold most true, to explain that very small percent. And then they go, why are we weird as Christians thinking that angels and demons exist? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't it be the case that we have evidence or have a religion to help explain what these things are? in how they work.
So
Given if you think aliens exist, we should hold to the interdimensional hypothesis. And if that's the case, we have a higher reason to think that what we know about angels and demons are more true than not, because this is how they're like Jesus randomly disappeared out of the room.
mm-hmm.
How do you explain that? Interdimensional hypothesis explains that. And so we go, why do you think we're crazy thinking that there's a realm that we can't see where these beings exist and can interact with our realm, given what we know of all the science?
I guess that's a weird bridge to cross. Just as somebody who like, I think the part that I get hung up on, and I would venture that most people would be with me on this, is that it comes from an idea that the supernatural and the observable universe are necessarily separate.
Sure. Right.
And so when we start talking about aliens and extraterrestrial life forms, that to me seems like a natural phenomenon, whereas the supernature, the realms of angels and demons, is relegated to supernature. And, and when you mix the two, it makes it almost sound like you're saying that extraterrestrial life is supernature, which to a degree I can kind of understand. And I've had that same thought.
So when I think of aliens, I think of they need to exist in the way we do today.
Yep.
When I think of angels, I think of beings that exist not in the way I exist, but can still exist in the way that nature can include them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So they're supernature in the sense of not how we exist, but they're still created beings that belong into a world that was created. And so like for me, I don't think heaven is this inorganic,
like
weird,
a spiritual state,
spiritual realm. Yeah. I think so. Well, let me put it this way. I think heaven was a created realm that is a different sort of dimension than the dimension we exist in our physical life we do here. But that doesn't mean it's not natural in the way God created everything.
Right.
But it's not natural in the way we exist in the here and now.
And I think
that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think I just finished reading Miracles by C.S. Lewis this week. He has a chapter in there where he talks about the reality as we see it, and it's kind of like string theory, just way simpler.
Yeah,
is the reality that most people live in is they observe the universe on a floor, a single floor, and so everything that must exist exists on this floor. When in reality, as he puts it, nature is more like a tower with multiple floors. Some things can go down but not up. Right. Other things can go up but not down. But you always have this existence itself is contained within that tower.
Yeah.
And so I think when you look at it in that perspective, everything you just said makes way more sense. Yeah.
So the last and final thing that I think is helpful here are what are called NDEs. And I think there's an argument that can be made. J.P. Moreland, William Lane Craig, and I know Gary Habermas is one of the lead sort of Christian theologians in this. And there's a lot of work I've read from MDs, medical doctors who I mean, there's a whole journal, not journal article, a whole sort of journal dedicated
like a
to
running
these
publication.
peer-reviewed running publication of these experiences. And so I think if NDEs, near-death experiences, are true, we have to accept that we're just not physical. There's something else a part of us that seems to continue to live on and is conscious and understands and communicates. And let me get into this. And so Gary Habermas, in his Opus multiple part volume he's writing before he's dead on the evidence for the resurrection, he has an appendix on his research on volume 1 of near-death experiences. So I just want to recap of sort of my 5 main categories, or my favorite 5 categories that he looks at, which sort of answers all of these skeptics. I require this to prove them to be true. Because I think a lot of times pastors and churches give examples and I go, that doesn't prove anything. This guy saw this. I'm like, okay, that doesn't prove anything, right? Yeah. What we need is tangible things that can be verified, and things that can be verified in such a way to believe if it was like a scandal would be so highly ridiculously improbable.
Unlikely. Yeah.
Very unlikely. let me give you the 5 categories I think meet the requirements to hold that NDEs should at least be something we take very, very serious.
Yeah, I'm excited about this because I've had friends who have experienced this.
Yeah. So the first was evidential. I'm gonna say NDEs from here on out, so I don't have to keep saying near-death experiences.
Please.
Evidential NDEs, corroboration within the room.
Okay.
Meaning they are, and it's not just like they're unconscious. They are medically dead for 10 to 15 minutes, and they're still being worked on, like medically dead, where no brain activity, no heart activity, past the time that the blood really should be pumping through their body. And they experience things within the room that you cannot explain. Let me give you one example from this. One example that I read was there's this older lady, it's a famous example, older lady that was medically dead for a while. And she noticed, like, where am I, right? She noticed that it was her body being worked on. Like, literally, you can tell, she could tell what they were doing, what they were dressed, all that stuff. And
Out of body experience.
Out of body experience. And you all know, like, I saw you doing like CPR and putting it, like, okay, we all know that's how it happens. Then she started to go above the ceiling. And all of a sudden she came back to. They got her back. Brain activity gone. Like, all this is measurable. You can see the journal. You can look up the journal. It's all free for everyone to look up. And she told the doctor this experience, and she told the nurses experience. I'm like, okay, whatever. She's like, no, let me prove it to you. If you look on the top of the machine, I can tell you the serial code number. And she tells the serial code number. And you got to understand, this is a machine that is like a big machine in the room that's like 3 inches from the ceiling. Where, I mean, this old lady walked into the room. Yeah.
You're not going to go up there and with a step ladder and
right,
check.
Exactly. So what ended up happening is when they were doing some work in the room, the doctor said, hey, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to go up there and I want you to give me the serial number. And it was identical to what the woman said. And it was like long, multiple letters, multiple numbers in a specific order, where it was on the machine, the color of the letters, the color. I mean, it was like...
Not just something you can commit to memory by looking at it.
Correct. Yeah. Something that you would have to say the maintenance guy set this up with this poor old woman who just so happened to randomly die. Like,
yeah.
And the doctors can't explain it.
Right.
And there is a corroboration of tangible for people outside the story going, I need to check on something that it is so, you'd be irrational to think that woman got up on the step ladder to look at these numbers and set it up. Right.
Yeah.
And so we have, thousands of these experiences of the same sort of category where they can corroborate within the room. The next one is evidential NDE corroboration at a distance. And this is what they mean. There are examples where persons have left their body, have gone through the roof in this whatever sense, their mind, their consciousness, whatever sense that is.
Yeah.
They didn't really know. And they started going across town. And they found themselves at a family or friend's house, looking in to their house. They can name what the person wore, their conversation, joke, they were cooking, what necklace they had on, who was at their house with them, what their neighbors would like, things that they were doing. And they came to, and they go, hey, this is what I experienced. And the doctors go, okay. They contact the family and friends with all this information. And the family and friends are like, what the heck? This is identical. So these NDEs are experiencing things at a distance that no one should know, was never told. They didn't visit the person the day after. They didn't email or call the person. How do they know these things? And the doctors check in on it. And it is found that every ounce of data is specific exactly to these minute things that are being said in conversations. How did this person know? Here's another one. Evidential NDE corroboration concerning previously deceased persons.
Okay. So this is like a
where
Jesus and Elisha kind of deal.
Kind of, yeah. Where there are, this one child met a deceased child where the parents had an abortion and never told anyone. And they said, hey, this is what happened. This is the information. This is the child's name. This is where you did it. This is how you did it. This is the doctor you were like, they knew all this information. And the parents came to and they go, Mom, I met so-and-so. Like, who? I met your first child, so-and-so. And the parents never told the kid. Like non-believers too. Like this is great. Like, and this is all experienced with people who should be dead clinically. And so you have conversations and knowledge of previously deceased person that there is no way this person should know of this. Next one, evidential corroboration from shared NDEs, meaning people share simultaneous, they share information. There's examples where people have died in the same hospital at the same time, and they share in the information with each other of what's happening,
they can experience that
they experienced it together. They know each other. They know their names. Where like you got rushed in unconscious
in 2 separate floors.
And they met each other and understood and had conversations like crazy. And they came back and the doctors checked in on everything. And like, yeah, was your guy dead? Yeah, he was dead for like 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Is that nuts? And the last one is evidential corroboration from sightless NDEers. These are people who are born blind, coming back with information of things they saw that it's impossible for them to know because they were born blind.
They were born blind, yeah.
And if this is true, and we can peer review from the medical point of view, go, oh my goodness, it is reasons to believe that we are more than just our physical body. That there is something that is spiritual, I should quote it in that way, right? Yeah. Whatever that means.
Something beyond naturalism.
Something beyond naturalism. What I also think, and I'm going to speak to you Christian listeners here, I think if this is the case, it is good evidence. Because I know my brother has this question, are we just some lifeless, when we go to be with Christ into the new heavens and the new earth, are we just some lifeless form that just feels happy and doesn't really know until he doesn't want to be this blob of nothingness, right?
Like a drop in the sea of consciousness type deal.
I think scripture can point to this, that we are alive in that sense. Our minds are there. Our understanding is there. Our relationships are there. Our understanding of what feeling good is there. Scared is there. I think our soul is alive and active, even if we depart from our physical body. I think when our soul's put back into our physical body, it uses it to experience things, right? But I do think this is good evidence to go, like when we go to be with Christ, there is a joy we experience immediately.
Yeah.
And we are aware that we are in fellowship with him and I think others.
Yeah, and
which is a cool thing to think of. We're not just this lifeless form until God knows when he comes back. You know what I mean?
And I truly don't think that God would do that anyway, just given the accounts in Genesis about what the old creation was supposed to be.
Right, exactly.
He created humans to exist on earth as an experiential being.
Sure.
And then he's not going to remove that in the new creation.
Sure, I agree.
So
even apart from our physical body, I still think we are conscious and understand and comprehend and can meet and experience things and know of these things. And I think this is medically reviewed evidence from skeptics that can go, wow, I can testify to this truth.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of doctors wrote books becoming Christian because of these experiences that they themselves were skeptical about and took a dive and looked into. So
fascinating.
Yeah. So this is what are the other arguments for God's existence that I like? I know we have 5 more for you, but we are going to then put this in a part 2 of episode 1. We didn't think we'd go this long on this one, but on our next episode, we're going to tackle the other questions and see as many as we can get. So if you have any questions or want to drop us a comment on new topics or ideas, or even come alongside this podcast in prayer or financially support, please email me at ryan@ryanwillert.org or go to the podcast page at riverradio.com. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next time on In Defense.
This podcast is a production of River Radio Ministries. You can find more podcasts like this one at riverradio.com. And if you like what you're hearing, make sure to subscribe wherever you're listening now. And be sure to tell a friend so they can listen too.